You're watching news at Prime. Let's get into another important discussion. The Judicial Conduct Tribunal. It is hearing the Eastern Cape Judge President Selby Mbenenge and the allegations against him. It's set to resume tomorrow. Now, the complainant Andiswa Mengo previously told the proceedings about alleged sexual harassment that she faced. Let's discuss this now and what constitutes sexual harassment in a workplace. And to discuss this with us, we're joined by Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa Executive Director Sibongile Ndashe and University of Pretoria's Diversity and Inclusion Specialist Tumelo Rasebopye. To both of you, thank you very much for your time. Let me start with you, Sibongile, and ask that very question I've prompted in the introduction. Do people know what generally constitutes sexual harassment in the workplace, you think?
I think they do. So good evening. I think people do know what sexual harassment is because many workplaces have got policies on the handling of sexual harassment. And if the workplace itself does not have a policy, there is a code of good practice that came from NADLAC. So it's a requirement that people who employ more than 50 people should have this. So in the judiciary, this is something that should be known because there are cases of sexual harassment that go through the courts. But sexual harassment is unwanted behavior of a sexual nature. And it must either have violated someone's dignity, whether it was intended or not, or created an intimidating, hostile, degrading or humiliating or offensive environment for them, and whether this was intended or not. So it can be one-off fact, so something that just happens once, or a pattern of behavior, but it does not necessarily have to be repeated. But in this case, we have heard in January, when the evidence was led, that this was an ongoing pattern that can constitute sexual harassment.
All right, and I'd like for us to talk in general terms because this particular hearing, it's yet to come to the conclusion. In fact, this time around, we are going to hear from the person that is being accused of sexual harassment, that is Justice Mbenenge. And so we've yet to come to the conclusion. We're unable to make up exactly what the two sides have said and what could be the conclusion. And which is why I'm asking that we keep it general. So let's come to you, Tumelo, because Sibongile says on the one hand, yes, people should know what constitutes sexual harassment because there are policies in the workplace and people ought to follow those. But you argue that some conducts which constitute sexual harassment have been normalized as socially acceptable and that employees need to be attentive to them. I'm thinking you are slightly differing with Sibongile, are you?
Greetings, Goli, and to your audience as well. I do differ slightly. The definition that Sibongile has given is indeed correct, but I think what we are coming to see in different spaces is that people seem to have different understandings of consent and practice it differently depending on who the recipient of their conduct may be. And we also know that that can also get conflated by levels of familiarity that we have with someone else. So if you get too familiar with someone, especially if we're thinking around workspaces, you may actually cross certain lines that you shouldn't have crossed simply because you think that you are now within an appropriate realm to interact with people and assume that they want and welcome certain interactions from you, such as giving a compliment.
Yeah.
I also think in our understanding of consent, people tend to think consent only works in sexually intimate spaces and contexts, and that it is not something that would apply even beyond what would be sexual. And I think that's some of the dynamics in the interactions that we've seen being described in this particular case, but in other cases as well, where someone thinks, but this particular interaction shouldn't require consent. If you're thinking around flirting, complimenting someone on how they look, how they are dressed, or even, I mean, the common things that people could do amongst friends, such as rating other individuals, that would still fall within the ambit of sexual harassment.
All right. Sibongile, Tumelo gives some examples there, and I'd like for I think the viewers to understand better what we are talking about here. Let's use the compliment on your dress sense, your style. Why would that constitute unwanted attention and therefore sexual harassment? I'm merely paying you a compliment on how a suit jacket sits on you or your dress sits. Why is that problematic?
I think when we reduce sexual harassment to just clothing or your dress sense, because the definition that I provided earlier, and we're talking about conduct, of a sexual nature. So the things that we are talking about, it's not just your jacket, for example. It's like, oh, your bum, that skirt could have had a longer slit, yeah, I'd like to see more of your cleavage next time, and all of those things, because we are talking about things that impairs someone's dignity, something that sexualizes someone in a workplace. And so we are talking about sexual harassment in a workplace because there is a particular context that applies, which may be slightly different from what people deal with in social settings when you're talking to your family or when you are talking to your friends. Because here we are talking about a particular relationship of power that has an impact, on whether you are able to feed yourself or your family, or not. So there is a lot of stake, because I think these kind of definitions of sexual harassment that does not pay attention to the impact on the victim's dignity or just well-being, livelihood, and all of that, acts like people are somehow sensitive, or just not able to take a joke, or just basically taking things too far.
Yeah.
We have seen the impact of what sexual harassment can and does, to people. So sometimes I do find these kind of examples unhelpful, in that way, that it can be compared to someone just complimenting you on the jacket, that you are wearing. Because there is something specific that the laws on sexual harassment came, to do. There was a menace, in the workplace that it wanted to attend to, that it helped to recognize sexual harassment as a form of discrimination because it impacts on how different people, particularly women, experience the world of work.
Tumelo, there is the problem, and Sibongile points to livelihood, and that worries, I would argue, both the victim and the perpetrator. So let's start with the victim. How do you go about reporting this as a victim, whilst at the same time making sure that you're protecting yourself emotionally and also key professionally?
So within different workspaces, there would be a particular office, whether it be HR. At the university, we have the transformation office that is designated towards addressing, investigating, and pretty much dealing with cases of sexual harassment. And what we've come to find is that a broader scope of understanding, or at the very least having a policy that clearly defines what sexual harassment is able to empower employees within a workplace to step forward and know that which they are able to identify, not only limited to their own personal individual experiences, but also that which is in company policies. And I think we also tend to assume that all institutions, all organizations have these policies, such as sexual harassment policies. So first and foremost, it is trying to find out which framework, policy, or procedure exists within your organization and start at that level. It is also important that recipients of conduct that is unwanted to them. And I would still insist that even an unwanted conduct, compliment, can constitute sexual harassment. Because when we're speaking about racism, we speak about microaggressions. When we're speaking about sexual harassment, it doesn't just end up at the ultimate act being sexual assault, but then we can have these events and activities and interactions amongst people that are unwanted. So as an individual, I can say, but I do not want a compliment from you. And that would be a form of fair discrimination within the workspace.
Yeah.
But a company having a clear policy is the best way in which you are able to safeguard a victim or someone who has been the recipient of harm from being able to come forward, claim their rights, and claim them in line with a policy that is applicable to everyone within that workspace. Then we don't need to deal with morality. We don't need to deal with, well, I didn't intend it to be that way, and so forth.
Yeah.
I think that is the most important part. Then that particular office plays its role from there.
Sibongile, you get to have the last word, and you have prompted the thought in your latter response when you said we have seen the impact of sexual harassment. Talk to us about that impact of sexual harassment on the perpetrator. This is the person accused of sexually harassing another. What's the impact there personally and professionally?
I think just about anyone who is accused of anyone, of any kind of offense or conduct, one of the things is that you are now in a position where you would have to bear the consequences, of your action. And if that's not something that you have done, then you are going to have to prove, your innocence. So, but there is all of this time, I guess, where you have to go through the process, whether it's criminal or civil or this tribunal that we are now looking at. So that's the first impact, that you either prove your guilt, your innocence, or that you are found, guilty, that you take accountability for your actions. And so I think most of the time, just like in typical settings, we find it hard, to really think about what's really going on the perpetrator, the person who has done this harm or accused of having done this harm. That's normally the impact. But accountability basically means that you will have to lose a job if it's a position of power. I think one of the things that we saw in this past week, a judge of a UN tribunal who was sentenced to court, sentenced to prison for over 6 years in the UK, for slavery, for example, modern forms of slavery. So those are some of the impact. This is someone who was doing a PhD in Oxford University. So that's the impact. But I think the larger impact on society is that people do see that the law may take a long time, but there is justice at the end of the tunnel, and that other people who are in the same position can be held accountable, especially if it is someone who is in such a high profile, position, that people begin to believe that there is something called justice because it can reach you wherever you are.
Yeah, your position of power does not protect you. Thank you so much to both of you for your insights. Sibongile Ndashe is with the Strategic Litigation in Africa, an executive director within that organization, and Tumelo Rasebopye is with the University of Pretoria, and the division is that of diversity and inclusion.